Wuthering Waves has been a game of all time. My day one impressions have been rather enjoyable, and it was due to me taking the game in for what it was, an explosive combat open world RPG with amazing music. In this video, we'll be taking a look at what's offered in this game based on my first day of playing. I'll also give a condensed story review without spoiling. Yo, what up, Toshi here. When you first hop into Wuthering Waves, you'll be able to choose between two rovers. Both, in my opinion, has stellar design, and I went with the male. In hindsight, I'm glad because there was no male character unlocked until you reach the gacha. After choosing my MC of choice, I pretty much learned the basics of the game, from how to control the character in the open world and how to actually engage in combats. Let me just preface and say from the get-go, the combat is very engaging. A lot of the weaker enemies are staggered against your attacks, but bosses and elites aren't as much and have a moveset to come along with them as well. I was very impressed upon being greeted with the background music when engaging with the various enemies. The electronic / house style music is a net positive for the immersive experience. After learning the basics, I would progress throughout the game, unlocking a free 4-star character that would accompany the MC throughout the journey. Yang Yang's overall design is very nice, and the character even has a glow effect added to her hair as well. I just didn't remember how I triggered it though. One thing to note is that even though Yang Yang being a lower rarity character that was obtained for free, had a nicely engaging combat sequence and an ultimate animation. Considering every other 4-star has one as well, this was very pleasing to me. Can't wait to get Donjin and see hers. The journey continued until the game would eventually bring you to the first boss, and for the record, this was one of the best fights I have ever experienced in a mobile game. The boss had a sinister-like design, a full moveset, many ways to show skill expression, and time windows to launch attacks and stagger them. I also thought the music that accompanied them was really good as well. After killing the first boss, which being the first fight was practically impossible to lose, would be some progression to the main story. A lot of terms will be thrown at you without too much of an explanation other than an abbreviated word giving a synonym to what was being mentioned. At the very least, this is only the beginning of the game, so this is just a textbook let Kuro cook moment. After putting two and two together, I realized that the main plot would essentially revolve around finding the truth about why the MC is essentially so important, or rather the chosen one, quote unquote, I like to call it. The easiest way to summarize all of this without spoiling. At this point, the game stops holding your hand and you're free to do as you please, such as traversing the open world, solving puzzles, and fighting those overworld mobs. I really liked how soon the game gave you breathing room. I found some puzzles genuinely confusing because the instructions on the written tutorials weren't really too in-depth. But that's alright, it's just a miniature puzzle after all. As for the traversing in the open world, I found it to be very fluid and smooth with just a minor complaint with the camera adjustment. But I do believe that's to blame because of the game's combat style. Unless the game decides later on to have two different camera focus points, one for combat and one for the general game, considering there's lock-on, I do see this being better optimized at some point though. I was distracted, not immersed with the open world exploration, and only because it just felt too similar to what I've already experienced in other open world gacha games. Really hard to change up a formula that just works. The game also does teach you about a unique feature that will carry over into the end game called echoes. These echoes are basically your relics, artifacts, preset gear with randomized stats, and you unlock these by killing mobs in the open world. There is a 5-piece set bonus with no extra slot for an off piece. Oh boy, here we go again. The first echo you equip in the echo slots will be the mob or unit you bring into combat. Each of these mobs have different effects that they can apply to the enemies, so I'm sure in the end game there will be a best in slot and all of that jazz. Kinda reminds me of elves from Honkai Impact 3rd. Eventually, I would remember exactly what I was doing and progress with the main story. At this point, the game does a better job at explaining some of the more important characters in the game, but some of the terms are still left with confusion because again, there was just so many thrown at once. I did like the difference in personalities between each character. Shixia definitely being one that stood out the most. She really likes spicy foods. One cool thing to note about Shixia, because at this point the game does give you her for free as well, she essentially has a dual wield gun weapon type, which is honestly a breath of fresh air. I can't wait to see what other characters are designed with using this primary weapon typing. It's a lot of fun, and again just really unique. Now at this point, you're taught how to use a glider alongside a grapple permanent ability, which has a cool animation alongside a very useful function for the traversing, whether that's being in the air or on the ground. You can also run on walls like Titanfall, which I also thought was another sick part of the traversing experience. Now to wrap up the last of the not soft lock tutorial, you progress through even more of the story until you meet a familiar face from throughout the journey. and her being at work in a medical facility could ultimately mean one thing. The game forces you to do a single pull in the gacha, which is typical in any gacha game at this point, and Baizi is the last character given from the single pull, which is guaranteed to give her and only her. She is one of the most useful characters given, with her being a healer. Once Baizi is unlocked and you add her to your party, the game essentially stops holding your hand and you're free to do as you please. By this point, I had already finished my day 1 playthrough because I felt like after reading a long text of unvoiced dialogue, which is also skippable by the way, I was really tired. I did take a further look at the gacha system, but I plan to make that into a separate upcoming video. So there you have it, my first day in Wuthering Waves was overwhelmingly positive, and I think that's thanks to not having too high expectations and treating the game as a brand new experience versus a familiar one, if you catch my drift. I will have a few videos throughout the week, and ultimately a video a week from now giving my final thoughts on the game overall, unless I feel the game has more to offer from where I'll be at that point. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your day. Peace.